Привет, меня зовут Юля, я из Украины, и я выпускница программы по обмену студентами ЮГРАД. ЮГРАД — это программа, которую спонсирует один из департаментов Соединенных Штатов Америки, и я училась там в 2010-2011 году в городе Ламона, штат Айова, Грейсленд университет. Я встретила там огромное количество интересных людей. Сегодня я хочу показать вам мое интервью, беседу с Дагом Джонсом. В этом году ему 71, и 10 лет назад я видела, как он организовывает масштабнейшее мероприятие, которое называется «Дни реконструкции гражданской войны». Я покажу вам немножечко самого мероприятия, мы поговорим о том, как он его организовывал, мы поговорим об истории, немножечко о гражданской войне, и напоследок чуть-чуть о том, как он сейчас есть президентом одного из исторических музеев в Америке. Hi, hello.
Hello.
We're doing our second interview today on a topic of, I would call it a history, really quite general, but yet,
I would like to introduce this topic with definition of American Civil War, the war that took place in 1861 to 1865. It was fought between the northern states that were loyal to the Union and southern states that were in favor of Confederate States of America. The beginning of the war was a result of a long-term controversy over the enslavement of black people, where the Confederate States in the South were advocating for the states' right to hold slavery. The Civil War Days reenactment in Lamoni, Iowa State, was a 2-day event dedicated to reenacting some of the battles from Civil War, bringing up the concept of living history, and making history more meaningful to people. This is where I first met Doug when he was organizing the event. Doug is now making history more meaningful by being the president of a historical society in Ohio State, Wayne County.
I imagine that is also a big part of your life as a whole, not just what I saw.
Yeah, it's become a larger and larger part of my life. As I get into it, there's more and more and more to do. But that's the fun of it, because there's more to do.
Taking up a position that is threatening to the federal infantry, which requires then the federal infantry to turn and acknowledge them. Cavalry, if used correctly, is moving back and forth throughout the entire engagement. And you can see the federal infantry beginning to get ground right there. There was no other way for them to do it. They had no satellites. They had to go and see them themselves. That was completely unrehearsed. I hope you all have an opportunity to interact with the obviously, we have a To outposition the Federal infantry. It's very, very dangerous. So they are very careful.
I'm in the witness protection program. We're gonna do it like that.
It's more like a game of chess, where you want to maneuver. Why not? It's really hard to get people to come back to another event.
History of this event. It's been a labor of love for you. It's come a long way, but over the years, what's it been like for you?
Well, it's been a labor of love for me, and it's been a labor of love for the community, and it's been a labor of love for the reenactors. The core value of this event is that it's buy-in for the reenactors and buy-in for the community. We've adhered to that, and that is what has made the event successful.
My really first question is, how did you get your first interest in history in general, I guess? Why did you decide to go into that? Why did you do all those things?
Well, you know, there are a number of threads that run through my life. I guess some of them are similar to other people. I don't know exactly. For some reason, I was always interested in history. I would read history as a kid. And I think it had to do with imagining a different time, even in the same place, that what things were like in the past. So I just think that kind of interested me. So I've always liked history as a topic. History is really different family narratives that cross each other. And so I think there's something about the human experience that really does interest me. It fascinates me. And that was at an early age. As I got older, well, that interest in what life was like for different people became even sharper. That is, when I was in high school, I began to act. And there you are. You're someone else in a different time, in a different place. And what's fascinating to me is to try to understand what it would be like. But really what cinched it for me was my son. At one point, he asked me what our ancestors had done during the Civil War. It had never occurred to me. But if you think of it, there it is. My family, actual people, and the Civil War. It made the event a lot more meaningful to me. So quite literally from his question, that's how I first went to a Civil War reenactment, and he just loved it. Oh, the uniforms, the tents. Oh man, this is great. He was a little kid. And so that's what started me doing that. But on the topic of having an interest in history, as a kid, I grew up watching TV. And I saw cowboys and Indians and movies, World War II movies. I was born in 1949, so all that stuff was very new. And heck, when it comes to the Civil War, I remember there were Civil War veterans alive when I was a kid. I remember the news story, the last one died, you know, so it's not that far back in time. So, I mean, I think I can go on and on about this. I think, you know, human beings are social animals. We require a context to remain sane. That's what culture is. Culture implies the sameness over time, that things don't change over time. And I mean, you have the same language, you eat the same food, you wear the same clothing, you have the same laws, you have the same values. I mean, that's what a culture is. People have to have that to be human beings. But different peoples live that, experience that differently. And I think what's key to the American experience of history, well, first of all, I would say Americans come through school and don't know a thing about history at the end.
That sounds familiar.
The classes were boring and who cares, and it's just names and dates and who cares about that? What does that mean to my life? And so people don't know. But you may have, I don't know how much of it you noticed, but when it comes to something like a living history, a living history means that there are people there they're sort of in their impression. They're wearing the clothes and they're acting as though they were someone else.
Yeah, I remember I met a president at the Civil War days.
Absolutely.
Abraham Lincoln. I talked to him. He told me stories, and I was like, okay, that was interesting.
Sure. But when you can make the connection for people between them sitting there right and their ancestors, there's a spark that happens. It becomes real to them. Just think, if you were to learn something about your father, that would be meaningful to you. Your grandfather, your great-grandfather. Well, my great-great-grandfather likely fought in the war. So it's not so far back.
Yeah, it does sound like a mix between the fact that United States culture is a mixture of cultures,
Yes.
and as well as that your history is not that long as a country, so you can touch it, more
Exactly.
closely.
And that's what a living history does. It means that people, you can touch the fabric, you can taste the food. I mean, just it's very visceral, it's very real. You get to see things were like that. I think it's wonderful.
So that concept of living history is something that kind of central to the reenactments, and it was a big part of the Civil War days as an event, right?
Exactly. So, well, as I said, my son and I went to a reenactment because he asked me about my family, about our family, and he loved it. We started doing it. I wanted him to experience being a soldier firsthand. I didn't want him to learn about it by watching movies and watching TV shows. I wanted him to feel how heavy the pack was on his back. I wanted him to feel how uncomfortable the clothes were, what the food tasted like, how heavy the gun was to carry it. I wanted him to experience things that were closer to reality. And I have to say that one important thread that runs through American history is obviously slavery. And in order to understand American society, you have to understand slavery and the impact it had. The year that I think is most significant is 1619. That's a long time, 401 years ago.
What is that?
1619 is when African slavery was introduced into North America.
Oh, you see, I didn't know that.
Okay, so right at the very beginning, in 1619, there were basically no Europeans here. There are a handful of Europeans here. So ever since the very beginning of our society, there have been slaves, non-humans, and then white people. It was even built into our Constitution. At the time the Constitution was written, it references slavery, and it counts each individual slave as 3/5 of a human.
Wow. Not really.
And so always there's been these two levels in American society. And even if you were not involved in slavery, you never saw it, you weren't around it, there was still that set of values built in to the way America existed. There was even in the 1800s. Now, the country was started in the late 18th century.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we get like a couple of generations later. We're in the 1840, 1850, right through there. There's still quite an argument about slavery. Our Constitution and some of our core values talk about freedom, equality under the law, equality of opportunity. And at the same time, we have people we call non-humans, whom we keep as slaves and make them work. There's a real conflict there. At one point, there was a court case where a slave, I won't go into the detail, but basically had reason to go to court to try to be made free.
Right.
And the courts decided that black slaves were not people. Therefore, they had no right to look to the courts for any kind of help. They couldn't file a suit. It was like a chair. Could your chair go to court for some reason because you treated it poorly? No. They were property,
Wow.
period. And it took an enormous war it didn't actually settle the issue, but what it did is it settled the legality of it. It made slavery illegal, but that did not change the cultural value.
Attitude.
The attitudes, exactly. It didn't change that at all. In fact, there was enough resentment in the South where the slavery was, primarily. That's really where the big amount of slavery was. There was such a resentment at being occupied by the Northern Army, because years after the war, federal troops stayed there to enforce the law of no slavery. Resented that so much. Now, that they really resisted any of those laws. They resisted them as much as they could. And the U.S. entered into what was called the Jim Crow era, which means there were local laws that effectively took away all the rights of citizenship for African Americans. African Americans were allowed to vote. Constitutional amendment passed that. They were able to vote. Well, the local laws made it impossible.
So like if you go to another city, that would have a local law different to other states.
Yeah, they might say, well, to be able to vote, you have to show some understanding of U.S. history. You have to show that you know some things.
Oh, I wish they asked that now. Everybody.
The examples were they would give someone a piece of paper with a text on it written in Greek. They'd look at it and say, I can't read this. Okay, you're not qualified to vote.
Wow.
And for a white person, do you know your name? Yeah, okay, you can vote. Also, there was a lot of violence. The number of lynchings, the number of murders is enormous. And you don't have to kill too many people to get your message across. No one's going to try and vote. I think I read literally yesterday, something like right after the war, something like 85% of African Americans in the South were registered to vote.
Okay.
A couple of decades later, 5%. So while the federal troops were there enforcing the law, black people could register to vote, could hold office. They did. But as soon as the federal troops left, boom, the local laws changed, and it really changed everything. So I talked about family. Now, Americans are taught to be proud of their history. our Constitution, the freedom, it's all these wonderful things. We're taught to be proud of that. And I think people just automatically want to be proud of their family.
Yeah, that makes sense.
So how do you reconcile pride in your family when your family owned slaves? Well, the way you do it, but not only did they own slaves, but there was violence and it was dreadful. So the way they reconciled it is they rewrote history. They changed history. And literally the history books in some areas tell a different story.
So they just pretend it never happened.
Well, slavery was, these people came from Africa and they really didn't know how to live here. And if they hadn't been kept as slaves, they might have just starved to death. We took care of them. They had a place to live. They had food to eat. A lot of slaves were happy.
Wow, that's the way to cover the shame.
That's complete crap.
Yeah.
In the Civil War, it wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. Just like the U.S., just like the American colonies had the right to leave Great Britain, we Southerners said we have the right to leave the rest of the country. These are, and it's written in the Constitution. States have rights. So there's a real tangle and a twist. And, if you build in really big lies into the core of your society, you're going to make really big problems. And if you look at what's going on in the U.S. right now, this is not the first time that there's been issues like this. It's kind of interesting that after the First World War, when some African Americans served in the military, after the war, when they came back, they weren't quite willing to put up with all the oppression that they were living under. So there was quite how do I say? I mean, there weren't the demonstrations quite like we have today, but there was quite a tension where the phrase is uppity. They were uppity. They were acting like they're not supposed to act. They weren't stepping off the sidewalk when a white person walked by. They weren't assuming the role of the victim anymore. Okay, well then at that point there was a great wave of the Ku Klux Klan getting more popular, and then during that period of time there were a lot of monuments built to the Confederate war heroes. And the purpose of the monument was to tell the black people, we're in control. We are in control. Second World War, the same thing. After troops came back in the 50s, that's when what we call the Civil Rights Movement started in the early 50s and middle 50s into the 60s. And it took until 1964 to pass what was called the Voting Rights Act, to assure that blacks had the right to vote in spite of these local laws that would stop them. And now today, and that didn't change a great deal, but now today, I'm delighted to see the pushback against the police. Nothing represents a society quite like their police force. How does the police force act? That tells you a lot about the country. And I think what we see now is profoundly shameful. And I really hope that the effort, the movement to change how the police act continues. I really hope it continues. And I intend to be part of demonstrations. I have already, because I think showing up matters. So we still argue over our history. We still argue over what happened 150 years ago and what happened in the Constitution. We still fight over it.
Okay, so I know that the Civil War days that I saw in Lamoni were an annual event, and you've done it for 14 years in a row, was it?
Yes.
That's wow. And I just wonder, what does it take to organize such an event?
Well, it helps at the very beginning if you're completely crazy
Okay.
to take it on. It was really a full-time job. Now, where we put on the event, it's a small community,
Right.
1,200 people, and then there was the college.
Yeah. Another 800 or so.
Yeah, and so one of the decisions I made about the event at the very beginning is I wanted everyone to be able to access it. I wanted everyone to be able to come. And the county we lived in was a very, very poor county, one of the poorest ones in the state of Iowa. So I decided that we would never charge for admission. So anybody could walk in for free. We would never charge for parking. So you drive up, park your car, walk in, see the whole event. Didn't cost you a penny. That meant I had to rely on donations. Now, we did pass the hat when there was a crowd there, yes. But it meant I had to get money from the city, from local clubs and organizations, from the Lions Club, from the Optimist Club. There were a couple of foundations we could tap into to get some money. So I had to go out and beg for money every year, all year. Also, I had to, the community had to support the event, because not just money, but there was so much labor that needed to be done. There was a local guy, was a friend of mine, who worked in construction, and he had a backhoe, and he would drive his backhoe to the battlefield, and he would dig up and make trenches for us to use. And then he'd come back later when it was over and close it up. He was never paid to do that, so it didn't cost anything, but I had to have his support to do it. I can remember we had big water tanks because we supplied water and there was no water available there. So it's a great big water tank that's on the back of a truck. And once it fell off and it broke a piece on the water tank.
Oh, no.
And without water, we can't have the event. And so I went into the plumbing supply place, and they were great. They went out of their way to find something for me, and then they wouldn't charge me. Another time, we wanted to burn down buildings. We wanted to blow them up, burn them down. So first we had to build them. And we were working away. It meant that reenactors had to come to Lamoni weeks in advance and spend the weekend working on building a building that we could put up and then blow up. Well, while we were doing that, there was another contractor doing work somewhere nearby, and he heard that we were about to go up to the lumber yard and buy a bunch of lumber we had to buy to build it. And he got on the phone and called the lumber yard and said, put all of their stuff on my bill. I never knew the guy, never met him before, but just right away he said, I'll pay for it.
That's really nice.
Kinds of support. When you don't have support, which is ultimately what happened to it, I gave the event to, I was going to quit. I'd done it long enough, thank you. And there was a couple in town who wanted to do it. They said, we shouldn't lose it, we have to take it over. And I confess at the time I told them, you won't be able to do it. I promise you, you won't be able to do it.
Crazy enough.
But what they did not do, they did not go to every club and organization in town just to talk about the event. To get people, you have to be a cheerleader, to get people thinking along with you, like, yeah, this is a really neat thing. This is a really nice thing. I would point out how many people we brought into town. I would point out what impact that had economically on the local businesses, and on and on and on. So, yeah, people were in support of it. But when this couple did not do that, they lost the support.
Okay, so the event stopped.
It lost its support.
Are you paid for making any of those events?
No.
Just crazy enough.
Yeah. Now I was paid by one small event, and the guy who was putting it on talked himself into it. He had been to Lamoni, and seen me hold a microphone and talk. But at his little event, I was in uniform. I was one of the soldiers.
Okay.
He said, gee, what you do adds so much value. I wish, God, I wish you could do it here. You ought to be paid to do that. I said, okay. You want to pay me? I'll do it. And, oh, yeah, okay. Yeah, he didn't realize he had talked himself into paying me. He paid me $100, and even then, he made up that number. I said to him, well, what do you think this is worth? He said, it's got to be worth, at least this much. I said, okay, you can pay me that much. And he really was stunned when he realized what he had done. But I knew the event had enough money. I would have done it for free. But no, not paid for everything. Now, the character you met as Abe Lincoln, he was paid.
Okay. How come?
There are some people who do that. They have an impression like that. But they have to be like the president or one of the significant generals. And then they develop a reputation in the community of reenactors, and they can make money doing it.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
Okay, cool.
And there are other people we have here in Wooster, what's called a Civil War Roundtable. And it draws a very large crowd every month. And someone will come and make a presentation. Often they are in character. They will come in as a certain person and talk about their life and talk about their experience there in the war and et cetera. And it can be actually very entertaining. And that's both men and women. There was one woman who presented an impression. She was a Confederate spy. It was an actual person. So she went by that person's name and could talk about that person's life and could talk about what she did and be very accurate. So this really was a description of somebody who lived, and these really were the things that they did. This person talked about what we call in first person. They don't say she did it, they say I.
Yeah.
And that can be very entertaining, and people will ask questions later on to learn more. And those people get paid little bits of money, honorariums, like $100. I did one and was paid $100, and I donated it to a nonprofit that works in domestic violence. I was glad to take their money so that I could give it away.
I find it interesting. So these people who do participate in reenactments and dress up and all that, is that like an official network all around the, United States, or what does it look like? How do you know each other?
A little bit, yes. It's not really official. A unit, how do I say? Who becomes an officer in a unit? A unit should be minimum of 10 people. I'm thinking of infantry. And probably 12. And you need an officer, and you need sergeants, and then you need soldiers to be in line. Well, how does somebody become a sergeant or an officer? You express an interest in it. You learn what the job is, and you kind of earn it. There's no official standard for measuring people, but inside the group, yeah, you're okay. Yeah, you know what you're doing. You're a good officer. You can be an officer.
And how do you find a group? Like, I never, do you go on the internet?
I don't know how they started.
Okay.
Way back. I do not know that. I know that there was once, it was very famous in the U.S., a meeting of veterans from both armies at Gettysburg, and they were all old men. It might have been in 1913 or something like that. So all the veterans are 50 years older. Now, they didn't reenact the battle, but they did reenact a part of it.
Okay.
And instead of fighting, when they came together, they all shook each other's hands and hugged each other. It's a very nice moment. They had no animosity toward each other. So I don't know exactly when it started or how, but I know that there are national organizations and for both armies. And I think a lot of times somebody joins one side or the other because of their family history.
Okay, that makes sense.
They're somehow honoring their ancestors by showing people today what they had to put up with, what they had to do.
Mm-hmm.
Because, the truth is, for both sides, the motivation for the soldiers was the same. The politics was different, but the soldiers,
Yeah.
they were both fighting for the same reason. They're fighting to defend their rights. And in the South, it was, the right to leave the country. Just like the colonies left England, we have that right. Also, and the way they're defending that right is it was their grandfather who fought in the Revolutionary War. So they probably had their grandfather's gun hanging over the mantelpiece. And they took that down and took it to war. It was very much their family. They were defending their way of life.
That makes sense, yeah.
Both sides. Now, again, the politics was very different. The politics was all about slavery. And for the North, it wasn't about slavery. It was about breaking up the country.
So I might have a silly question. If the Civil War had a different outcomes, would that mean that the northern part would be separated from the southern part?
Absolutely.
Okay.
And it almost happened. I'll tell you very, very briefly that, of course, the war itself was horrific. It was just dreadful because they used Napoleonic tactics, which meant that soldiers marched around in groups
Mm-hmm.
and all fired at once.
Okay.
They had the weapons they carried were called smooth-bore muskets. That means that the long metal part, the barrel of it, was smooth inside.
Mm-hmm.
So the projectile would go out and it would kind of go anywhere. It would be very erratic as it went through the air. It was hard to hit something. So the group firing, you were sure you hit something out there.
Mm-hmm.
What had happened just before the war is they developed rifling, which means they put a groove in like a spiral inside the barrel. That makes the bullet spin.
And go straight.
Just like throwing a football. If you get it spinning, it goes straight.
Mm-hmm.
And it goes farther. So all of a sudden, they marched soldiers up to each other and they slaughtered each other. It was just disgusting what they would do. And I forget where I was going with that. Why was I doing?
No, that's just because I asked you what would be the outcome.
What would be the outcome? Okay, so I wonder. So you have to imagine that this war is horrible. And if you're a soldier, you start fighting in 1861, 62, 63. You're fighting through most of 1864. And there are tens of thousands of people dying. There are over 600,000 to 800,000 deaths. There were more Americans killed in that war than all the other wars combined, more than all of them combined. It's still more. We'd have to have some very big wars even to equal that number. So just terrible slaughter. In the election of 1864, presidential election came up.
Mm-hmm.
Abe Lincoln ran for re-election, and the person who ran against him had been the top general in his army. And his platform was, elect me and the war's over in one day. We'll just settle with these people, stop fighting. You want to go home? You want to stop dying?
Of course, everybody says, yeah.
Well, now, the soldiers, and that was the first time that the United States ever had an army of that size. That no one had ever thought of that before.
Mm-hmm.
And it was the first time that they were allowed to vote absentee ballot. They were allowed to vote, even though they were out on the front, they still had their votes counted. And they needed to pass a law for that to happen. So why did they vote to continue fighting?
I don't know.
Well, I'll tell you. It's funny I know the answer to that. when the Northern Army, if you think of the individual soldier in the Army, when they went into the South, they were shocked at what they saw. They were shocked when they saw slavery. They'd heard of it, they knew about it, but they saw it, and it was so dreadful. And at the same time, some of these same African Americans were allowed to join the Federal Army. Mm-hmm. And they saw them in uniform, in battle, and they saw they were just as brave as they were. There was no difference. So they didn't actually fight shoulder to shoulder, they were in separate units, but they saw them fighting and thought, we respect those people. We respect their bravery and their abilities. So they looked at slavery on one hand, and they looked at these people on the other hand. And then they would sit around campfires at night, and they would talk about, why is this happening to us in our lives? Why do we have to do this? Now, at the time, people believed that their circumstances in life were formed by God. God directed things. And if you were a good person, you'd have, a good life, good thing, you'd be happy, your family would be fine. And if you did something terrible, you'd get punished in some way. So they wondered, what have we done to deserve this? And it occurred to them. It's our complicity in slavery. That's why we're being punished, is because we have stood by and allowed slavery to continue.
Okay, so that's why they cannot bear...
The combination of all those things, that's why they said, we have to finish this. We have to finish this fight, or our children will have to fight it, or our grandchildren will have to fight it. So we're going to finish it. So they voted for Abe Lincoln. They voted to continue to fight and die. Mm-hmm. It became a matter of slavery to them as the war went on. And the reason that we know this, it's actually that they had newspapers in the camp. They had a camp newspaper that they would make. And there's an enormous amount of documentation from the Civil War. And for some reason, nobody had ever looked in the camp newspapers. There's just such a volume of documents and things. And one researcher looked through it and was stunned. She read articles, she read camp newspapers from all around the federal forces. And so she could say with authority that the troops agreed to this. They felt the same way. They talked about it. Mm-hmm. It was an important thing for them to figure out, what have we done to deserve this? They had to get an answer then. And the only answer they had was slavery. And that's what determined for them to continue fighting to the end. So what, if it had been different, what would have happened? Split, and it almost happened. If that election had gone the other way, boom, it would have split right then. If the soldiers decided to stop fighting and dying, there'd be two countries in North America. Well, if you look at Europe, obviously there's lots of countries. Yep. Nothing odd about splitting up. What would have happened in World War I and World War II if there was no U.S.?
Never know.
Who knows? I mean, it really would have changed world history.
Okay. Well, that very much covers the topic. I'm only curious now to learn, do you have any maybe special goals as a president of a historical community right now for this year?
Absolutely. You have to understand, when I came to Wooster, I retired. And I wasn't going to do anything. Thank you. I didn't want any deadlines. I didn't want any pressure. Not at all.
Didn't work that well.
Didn't work that well. And but you know, but I got here and I went to various organizations to see if they did something that was interesting to me. And they were all wonderful organizations, but they just didn't have something that I wanted to do, personally wanted to do. Because if I didn't want to do it, I wasn't going to do it. Remember, I'm retired. So I got connected to the Historical Society. They wanted me to do a first-person impression of someone, and I did, of someone who used to live here in Worcester. And then they kind of talked me into joining the Board of Trustees. Okay, so I did that. And I'm the guy who didn't say no. They asked me if I would be president-elect, and I said yes, and now I've become president. And the reason I did it, I thought about it before I committed to it. There's things I want to do. It's a wonderful museum. It's stunningly rich with artifacts. It really is. They've done a wonderful job over the decades. It's been around since the early 1900s, 1904, in fact. But very little about American Indians, almost nothing about African Americans. So my primary goal is to add American Indian history and African American history so that we're going to tell everybody's story, not just the white folks. It's the white folks whose story is told there. And I want a school kid, I don't care what color the kid's skin is, school kid being led through the museum looking around, I want the kid to see himself or herself.
Yep.
Because otherwise they'd walk through and look around and say, wow, boy, I don't exist. So that's my main goal.
Okay.
And now that the coronavirus has hit, we counted on people coming in and taking tours. They would pay a little bit. We had a lot of presentations that we made that people would come and pay to see, and they couldn't do that anymore. So I figured that if they couldn't come to us, we had to go to them.
Okay.
Or else we would cease to exist. So we've started a major project producing audio and video, video of our exhibits, break into chunks and broadcast them through social media. The same thing with just audio. There are things that we're recording that we're going to push out through social media. And in order to do this, I had to recruit. And what I did professionally was recruit. I recruited people. So
you can use
figure,
it.
what skills do we need? We need marketing. We need video production. We needed other ones because we've also reorganized how we do our accounting. So we had a new finance chair and a new treasurer, and we've redone things so that it's better, simpler to read, etc. We also found problems that we could fix. So that's really what's motivating me, is to keep the place alive now, build in capabilities that the organization will benefit from forever, and also make sure we are a place that shows everybody's history. So that's why I'm now overly busy, and I have papers strewn all over my desk of this project, that one, the other one, and why it's important to me to keep this in mind and have fun with it and play with it and make it fun. When it ceases to be fun, I will stop doing it.
Well, sounds great. I'm happy to see you having that business and being involved in that.
I have a team that does things. It's marvelous.
Well, you find your place. I'm glad.
Which is where I'm doing as little as possible.
Exactly.
And trying to have as much of an effect as possible, though.
Well, I'm great. I hope that all comes true, and good luck with the video making and audios. Keep me updated. Be curious to see. I just watched the Indiana Jones movie yesterday, so I'm in the mood for that sort of thing.
Okay.
doesn't connect that well, but he also hunt for museums and to bring the history back to everybody to be accessible. So in a way. All right, that I guess covers everything that I wanted to talk about today.
Wonderful.
Thank you for your time today again.
And I look forward to talking to you again.
We will do.
Okay. Bye-bye.
Bye.